lots of fuzz to me. Every bone has got.
So my name is Elizabeth McCumber. I last December earned my master's in cultural anthropology from Oregon State University, and I am now sort of in that liminal space after graduation. But I'm a communication strategist and an independent scholar, and my interests are place relationship, fairy tales, oral tradition, mythology. So I was a kid when my family moved away from my childhood home. I was born in northwestern New Jersey, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, rolling hills, huge boulders, endless swamps. That wind, eating pierogies and hard rolls, that place, that's what home means to me. Then we moved to Texas, where I became a linguist and an anthropologist at the age of 11. I'm joking, and I'm not joking. My interest in language took root when I had to figure out fast how to deconstruct my own dialect so that I wouldn't lose it. And my interest in culture started when I found myself in a different world. My interest in rootedness came from being uprooted. We live in a time of uprooting. People are moving across the country to escape climate change. Economic instability shakes the ground underfoot. Racial violence turns the world upside down. And yet, it is possible to deepen one's roots even when the ground is shifting, to find stability, to connect to past and present, self and other, to build resilience. It's possible through the stories we tell. At any given moment, we're all telling ourselves a story, aren't we? Brené Brown popularized that idea for a general audience a few years ago with her book, Rising Strong, a New York Times bestseller. We will always make up stories, Brown said. Meaning making is in our biology. And our default is to come up with a story that makes sense, feels familiar, and offers us insight into how best to self-protect. Sometimes the way we explain our experiences is true, she said, and sometimes it's not. I'll add that either way, the stories we tell give shape to the deeper narratives that express what we believe about where we came from, where we stand now, what world we find ourselves in, and what to hold on to. As folklorists, we have a rich vocabulary for talking about stories. Right here at an annual meeting of the American Folklore Society in the 1960s, William Bascom defined myths as prose narratives, which, in the society in which they are told, are considered to be truthful accounts of what happened in the remote past. Legends, he said, are prose narratives which, like myths, are regarded as true by the narrator and his audience, but they are set in a period considered less remote when the world was much as it is today. What I like about these definitions is how well they work to describe not just the stories of other cultures and times, but also our own. Speaking as somebody who lives in the United States, what does our society think about its past, whether remote or recent? What stories get told here about the world and our place in it? It is important to know what the majority in a society believes to be true at a given point in time, Bascom said, for people act upon what they believe to be true. And one way to know what people believe is to listen to our stories. According to the communication theorist Walter Fisher, who established the narrative paradigm in the 1980s, stories are a cognitive vehicle. They are enactments of the whole mind in concert with itself. In the beginning, the Big Bang created the heavens and the earth. Now the universe was formless and soupy, with elementary particles, quarks, and leptons, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the basic laws of physics said, "Let it explode." And it exploded. Thank you for humoring me. This is what you get when you take a scholarly account of the Big Bang, put forth by the theoretical astrophysicist Michael Turner, and you retell it in the language of Genesis. Through a little bit of verbal play, I am making the point that this story, which is to the best of Western knowledge a true account of the remote past, is not just science. Definitionally, it's also a myth. It's a cultural story. The Big Bang reflects the beliefs and values of those who tell it, including our interest in verifiable hypotheses and systematic knowledge-making. So what other stories do we hold to be true? We've covered where the universe came from, so where did society originate? Where's it all headed? The rise of Western civilization, the march of progress from the dawn of agriculture 10,000 years ago to the global transformations of modern technology. These narratives are familiar because we use them to explain the world and our place in it. They're dominant narratives, which, like the Big Bang, are put forth as strictly a matter of fact, not culture, as knowledge, not myth or legend. They show up in books, in documentaries, at school, in conversation. And when they do, rarely is their cultural specificity acknowledged. Yet, as narratives, they both express and promote a specific set of values, beliefs, and behavior. And the problem is they're failing us. Just a few years ago, the 2020 census confirmed that the demographics of the United States are changing. For now, white people are still a majority in the United States, but by 2043, it's projected to become both a majority-minority and a plurality nation. And in fact, almost 1/3 of people in the United States are living in a community where that's already the case. During the colonial era, the West defined itself as the prototype of human progress. But there are vast numbers of people that this narrative does not represent, that it in fact seeks to exclude. The rise of the West has been told and taught as the central story of human history, but that center cannot hold. The rumblings are ecological as well as social. According to the latest climate assessment here in Oregon, we're in the midst of major changes with an increase of flooding and droughts, wind and wildfire, glacial retreat, and rising sea levels. Where's the myth of progress against the backdrop of the Anthropocene? Can we really believe that whatever the case, science will fix it? That technology is the future, resource extraction is an economic imperative, and all we have to do is sit tight and turn into the Jetsons. Western superiority, colonial control, technological utopia. These themes run to the root of our core narratives in this country, and they are not the answer. In fact, they perpetuate the type of thinking and behavior that led to the pressures we're facing now. Still, I continue to believe that stability, connection, and resilience are possible, even given the social and ecological rumblings of our moment. But if we're to find them, we're going to need different narratives. The good news is that as storytellers, we have a creative role to play in all this. The stories handed down to us are not the only way to explain the world in which we find ourselves. Like the Big Bang, narratives of Western history and the myth of progress are not strictly a matter of fact. They're culturally specific, not inevitable. Even for those whose heritage is rooted in the West, there are other ways to tell our stories, which, as we know, are living processes, ever adapted to new contexts, for new needs. In other words, stories change, and we can change them. We can draw from an underlying water table of beliefs, emotions, and values to grow better roots, to foster cross-cultural understanding at a time of demographic shift, and to strengthen our relationships to the land in a time of climate crisis. This work has a name. Narrative change is a methodology that draws on people's existing worldviews to modify or even replace the stories we're telling ourselves about who and where we are in the world. We humans are continually constructing the social reality in which we live. The idea behind narrative change is that if we pay attention to the stories we're telling and the functions they serve, we can get intentional about the reality we're building. Let me give an example. This summer, I helped develop communications for the Pathways Narrative Project. This is a pilot program focused on making positive social changes in the career pathways space in communities across the United States. The organizer, a strategic firm called Wonder, partnered with 9 organizations to understand the story patterns that shape belief and behavior in their communities. Then they worked with youth to shift those narratives, helping youth, especially marginalized youth, build brighter futures. The goals were big and specific. Participants convinced conservative legislators to increase funding for community college. They persuaded employers to offer more apprenticeships. They prompted business owners to hire local talent. And they inspired young people to consider a much wider array of possible paths. These are measurable outcomes, and narrative change was the tool they used to accomplish them. Again, the way people think and act is shaped by their identities, emotions, values, and beliefs. If you take time to connect, to understand the good reasons threading through people's stories, and to grasp the experiences to which those stories give voice, you can build capacity to shift the narrative. You can invite new ways of seeing. You can nourish behaviors of resilience and stability, even in a time of change. For me, that word stability has everything to do with place relationship. As I said earlier, the part of the world that means home to me happens to be 3,000 miles away from where I've chosen to live. I know that I'll never live there again. My parents are here now. My spouse and his extended family are here. My children were born here and are growing up here. I won't even suggest taking that away from them because I know from the opposite end how much it means to have a stable root. I am painfully aware that I am not from this place. So for me, land relationships, the pursuit of belonging, this question of roots, these are perennial riddles in my life. So it's no surprise that the same questions spilled into my graduate research. During my master's program at Oregon State University, I conducted an ethnography of place at Triangle Lake in a little valley called Lake Creek in the Central Oregon Coast Range. As with any pioneer community in this country, there's a lot of friction in the history here. Settlers of the 19th century saw themselves as part of an inevitable civilizing wave of progress, and those who landed in Lake Creek were no exception. Nationwide narratives of civilization and white supremacy set the course for westward expansion and Indian removal, damaging complex worlds of cultural and linguistic diversity and imposing unthinkable human suffering. Narratives of individual opportunity fueled the exploitation of land, whose abundance was interpreted as an economic resource on which to capitalize. The impacts of these events have not gone away. They're still with us. The stories that gave rise to them are still with us. And yet, these are not the only stories that can be found in the valley of Lake Creek. In my thesis research, I interviewed people of all ages, from 12 to 98 years old, male and female, Native and Euro-American. I interviewed people who live there and those who don't, people with deep generational ties and those who are new, people who've left and those who've come back. I learned that people experience profound rootedness through their ties to Lake Creek. I learned that people identify themselves and their place in the world through their relationships to this watershed. What stories did they tell to give voice to this? Sometimes place relationship is a force to strain against, a clinging net that a person struggles to escape. Sometimes it's an uncomfortable attachment that keeps calling them back long after they've left. Sometimes it's a set of obligations that a person feels toward a specific part of the land or the community, causing them to make significant life choices, sometimes sacrifices, for its sake. Often, place relationship is a root whose tensile strength grounds a person in love and responsibility despite winds of change. There is a holding power here that both limits and stabilizes movement. This is the narrative of place relationship that I heard in my research. There's another aspect to these stories. People of different backgrounds and identities who have relationships to this place feel a responsibility toward a common relation, the land. And this feeling brings with it potential for unexpected connections. Even across a social divide, even despite a fraught history, a common concern for place can inspire not only personal identity and belonging, but also interest in others, generosity and collaboration. Speaking with Native and Euro-American participants about Lake Creek, I was impressed by the need and also the opportunity for cross-cultural dialogue. In the context of climate change especially, we need all of our knowledges pulling together, Western and Native, individual and collective. We each have a role to play in making a future here. I've said that stories express people's deep down beliefs. Drawing upon my own experiences, personal, professional, and academic, I've come to believe that narratives of place relationship can be an antidote to the myth of progress. The philosopher Donna Haraway put it this way: we need to embrace particular and specific embodiment rather than the false vision promising transcendence of all limits and responsibility. Instead of locating ourselves in the midst of this societal journey from a barbaric past to a civilized present to a future on Mars if necessary, what if we saw ourselves as rooted primarily in place? What would it look like to opt out of the modus operandi to advance and control, and instead to water roots and invest in soil? In what ways can we build bridges for cross-cultural dialogue, reaching across social divides to collaborate on our common concern for the relations that we share, for this land and for each other? How might that narrative show up in the stories that we tell? Place relationship is only one alternative storyline, of course. I'm sure you can think of others, drawing on your own experiences. Suffice it to say that the stories we tell are an alchemy with power to transform belief into action. They place us in the world and among one another. They tell us where we stand, who we stand with, and who against. They can be true or untrue, for better or worse, suited or ill-suited to the challenges of our time. They can foster cross-cultural understanding. They can deepen our relationships to the land we inhabit. They can equip us for the world that's emerging. Here on this shifting ground, the stories we tell have potential to help us put down new roots and to root out the ones that aren't working, to generate stability and help us navigate what's to come. Thank you.